Thank you, Anita. I'll introduce today's keynote speaker. He's well known internationally, and he knows the region quite well. He lived in Aleppo as well. He's married to an Armenian lady. He came all the way from University of California in Davis. He's the professor of human rights studies. He's also the co-director of the Human Rights Collaboration at UC Davis, and we are partners at the Institute with him. Dr. Keith Wattenbo is a pioneer in the teaching of comparative genocide for nearly 20 years. During those years, that teaching has expanded into developing curriculum for high school teachers and lifetime learners. He will also contribute to the development of legislation that will enable better access for California's high school teachers to genocide and human rights studies, pedagogical tools, and resources. In his talk today, Professor Wattenbo will reflect on the importance of genocide and human rights education at every level, the political dimensions of this field, including genocide, denial, or minimization, and finally, how genocide education can help in the fields of transitional justice and ending impunity. Please welcome Professor Keith Wattenbo.
I don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to go into it. I've written my comments, and I'm a college professor, so I write these down so I don't go over time, not so I have enough to say, because we could just keep going forever. I wanted just to start, though, by offering a note of thanks to the Isam Ferris Institute. Oh, okay. The Isam Ferris Institute for supporting work that, and partnering with the University of California, Davis, on a project that's supported by the Ford Foundation to improve access for refugee university students to higher ed. That's one part of my life where I've been working extensively over the last several years to try to mitigate the effect of higher education, the effects on higher education of the war in Syria. And here we are working with AUB students and refugee teachers out in the Bekaa Valley, improving what we call the Article 26 backpack. And I'd love to talk about that with any organization who's interested in it further on. But in my heart, I'm a historian of the modern Middle East. These are three of the books I've worked on recently. My first book, Being Modern in the Middle East, 20 points for anyone who can identify that clock tower. It's Bab al-Faraj in Aleppo. And then Bread from Stones, which just came out, which is in many ways a history of Near East relief and its efforts on behalf of Armenian genocide survivors. And that cover, of course, is a photo of a soup kitchen set up by AUB faculty during the First World War. And finally, I helped edit Karnik Panyan's memoir of his time in Antura, where during the genocide of the Ottoman Armenians, large numbers of Armenian young people were forcibly Turkified. But what a theme running through all three of these books is the importance of children in the building of society, but also the harm that can be visited upon children during war and genocide. So that's the thrust of my talk today, is to think about what happens to children during genocide, why studying that is critical for not only understanding genocide, but arriving at strategies for their prevention. So, few Armenian intellectuals of the Ottoman Empire survived the extrajudicial murder, deportations, and exile of the 1915 genocide. Among those who did was Yervan Odian, 1865 to 1926. Odian, a journalist and a satirist, published a serialized memoir of his ordeal shortly after the end of the war in the Istanbul Armenian language newspaper Zhamanak. Entitled, it's been gathered now into a book and translated, entitled Accursed Years 1914 to 1915. This remarkable first-person account of surviving genocide is comparable to the writings of Primo Levi. So I'm going to zoom ahead. Odian escaped the first rounds of the liquidation of intellectuals in 1915, only to be exiled to the city of Aleppo, where because he had enough money, he was allowed to stay in the Baron Hotel for the first few weeks, and then the local Ottoman police came and said, no, Armenians can't stay in a nice hotel. You have to remove yourself to the concentration camp that was set up in a field on the outskirts of town called Sabil. And the background picture here is a photograph of that. One of the things that's important in Odion's work is that he was among the first Ottoman Armenian intellectuals to identify the large-scale transfer of children and trafficking not as a byproduct of the genocide of 1915, but rather as a central element of it. It was one of the crimes that constituted what is to Armenians the Metz-Yagern, the great crime. When Odion was transferred from the palatial Baronne Hotel to this concentration camp, he began to notice something that he first encountered a form of child transfer that was unprecedented in its horror: the sale of children by their own desperate parents. And amidst accounts of disease, starvation, and unremitting hardship in the camp, he described the daily visits of Arab, Turkish, and Jewish women, and I'm quoting here, who would come from Aleppo in carriages and start going from one tent to another, asking, "Satılık çocuk var mı?" Are there any children for sale? Odion writes that while wealthy families rejected outright these inquiries, poorer families under duress did sell their children for tiny sums, sometimes after the purchaser promised to return the child if the internally displaced family survived, or persuading them that they were going to die as it was, why not let at least one survive? He goes on to describe the women would put 1 or 2 mejidiyas into the husband's hands, just a trifle sum. And putting the child in a carriage, mother would cry, regret what they did, and wish to run after the carriage, but it would have already left. I saw a woman go mad a few hours after selling her 2 children. Others fell into a sort of lethargic, stupid state, silent, their gaze distant, sitting for hours on the ground. You'd think that their feelings and consciousness were dead. They'd become animal-like. Thousands of boys and girls were sold in Sabil in this way to Arabs, Turks, and Jews from Aleppo. The small children of about 7 to 10 years old, usually considered to be valuable, especially the girls. The sale of children for Odion constituted a complete moral collapse in the face of genocide itself. It was, and I'm quoting again, the most terrifying side of the dreadful crime of deportation. It's impossible to imagine that humanity could sink any lower, unquote. The sale of children was not unique to the camp in Aleppo and happened elsewhere during the deportations, including episodes where children were auctioned. Elsewhere in Odion's memoir, he does acknowledge how sometimes the children who were sold in such a way stood a better chance of survival than the rest of their families. And indeed, Armenian oral histories and memoirs from that time are replete with accounts of moments of generosity towards child survivors. Though these in general, these are accounts by Armenians who rejoined the Armenian community after the war and following large-scale efforts at humanitarian rescue, including by the AGBU. Despite an emerging literature in Turkey by the grandchildren of transferred Armenians, little is known of those who were integrated into Muslim households. Odion's horror at the sight of Armenian children being sold and his clearly painful admission that for some of the children themselves, sale under duress or extra-legal adoption could mean survival, if not something more, is among the most complex dilemmas at the center of the history of the forced transfer of children, an element of the crime of genocide and a violation of human rights. Now, what I'm arguing or proposing here is that the history of the phenomenon of the forced transfer of children during civil conflicts, like the Armenian Genocide, is critical to the broader understanding of genocide as a modern social phenomenon. Moreover, that history helps clarify the conceptual origins of the historical relationship between the rights of the child and individual human and minority rights as these have evolved before and immediately after World War II. The case of the Armenian Genocide, where the whole range of the kinds of transfer and recovery took place that would be repeated throughout the 20th century in places like South America, Africa, and Australia, is ideal for this task. Armenian children were sold, bought and stolen during episodes of mass killing and forced migration. They were placed in state-run orphanages, converted to Islam, and the boys circumcised. They faced organized foster placement, often in the homes of those responsible for the deaths of their parents, and loss of inheritance rights. And after the war, they were affected by national and international efforts at repatriation and rehabilitation. Indeed, interwar efforts on behalf of Armenian children were significant in scale and reach and helped shape modern thinking, not just about genocide, but the value of humanitarian assistance to children in post-conflict and post-genocide settings. The historical discussion of child transfer in the field of human rights history is a point of departure for understanding the 20th century elaboration of child-centered human rights practices and norms, including ideas about the best interests of the child, the need for which has become more acute as debates about the treatment of indigenous children encountering settler colonialism in Canada, the US, and Australia have been conceptualized in the framework of genocide. In other words, over the last 10 to 15 years, there's been a radical rethinking in Canada, the United States, and Australia, in which understanding the treatment, especially of indigenous children, by the United States government, the government of Canada, the government of Australia, has been reconceptualized as a form of cultural genocide. And in fact, this has led to immense pushback from the governments of those countries who dispute the possibility even of something like cultural genocide, which they argue doesn't lead to death. In other words, these children that are being transferred are not being killed. So how could it possibly be genocide? This doubt is in part a manifestation of an anxiety about acknowledging an element of genocide that is not exclusively about mass killing. So just to review very quickly, Article 2 of the Genocide Convention, which is in fact what we are commemorating with this conference in part, lists a whole series of kinds of genocide which are not necessarily lethal, but lead to the destruction of groups, including E, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. The layers of debate about the historical meaning and definition of forced transfer of children and genocide inform how the phenomenon is discussed in human rights history. Those questions were also present in the elaboration of the crime of genocide and the historical theory of genocide during the drafting of the United Nations Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide. Despite that celebration that we are having today, genocide scholars tend to dismiss this convention, in fact, as inadequate or perhaps merely incomplete definition of genocide. And chief among their objections is the fact that in the final versions of the convention accepted by the UN, the concept of cultural genocide is excluded almost entirely. The only aspect of cultural genocide that remains in the international treaty is the forced transfer of children. This inclusion poses a question. What is it about child transfer that led to its retention with almost no objection, while the other aspects of cultural genocide as proposed by Lemkin were jettisoned altogether? At the outset, it is important to recall that as understood by Lemkin, genocide was less about the individual human rights of the victims of genocide, but rather the collective rights of a nation. Equally, he conceived genocide as not merely the extermination of the individuals, but rather as the nation's destruction through physical, biological, cultural, political, and cultural means. His book, Axis Rule, unfolded his theory, does not enumerate the forced transfer of children as a technique of genocide. Instead, the phenomenon of the forced transfer of children, though clearly implicit in other elements of his early ideas about cultural genocide, was only elaborated in later discussions amongst UN experts. Those deliberations, however, are particularly useful in helping us understand the role of children in the conceptualization of genocide. And this is a point where I think it's one of the things when we're beginning to think about genocide going forward that I think requires a great deal of our attention. It was through a South American delegate's intervention on the question that an alternative and broader understanding of the forced transfer of children as genocide has emerged. The European and American understanding of forced child transfer tends to emphasize the idea of race and racial reorganization. The discussion in particular, however, by Venezuela's representative to the Genocide Convention, the international lawyer and poet. See, if you're a South American, you can be an international lawyer and a poet. They don't let us do that in America. Vincent Perez Peroza was unique in the way it explicitly connected alleged humanitarian treatment of children with the possibility of genocide, describing a situation that obtained not just in the case of the Ottoman Armenians, but also in the treatment of children during colonialism and even by aggressively modernizing and centralizing states. I'm going to read a part of his quotation, but what he's really describing is a situation, actually I'll skip it, but where he's describing a situation where you can imagine, say, young people, children that are part of an Indian group in the jungle whose public health or education is of a fairly low standard, and the state could go in, take the children, educate them as citizens of some new nation, Venezuela or Colombia, prevent them from speaking their own languages, prevent them from having contact with their families, cutting their hair, making them wear clothes. And even though this might improve the material quality of their existence, they've stopped being what? They've stopped being Indians. And you can imagine how this was also an argument that was made by someone like Halide Adib Adivar, who ran the Antur orphanage, which I'll talk about in a second, who would have argued, when we took Armenian children like Karnik Panian and we put him in that orphanage, and we stopped him from speaking Armenian, we circumcised him, we gave him a Muslim name, we did something of extraordinary value to him. We made him a Turk, a member of the dominant citizen group in the Ottoman Empire. So from her perspective, from the perspective of do-gooders in the United States and Canada and Australia who brought Native Americans into boarding schools where the task was to kill the Indian but save the man, the intent was not genocide. In fact, it was very philanthropic. But the outcome was genocide, according to the Genocide Convention. For intellectuals like Odion and others like the Armenian feminist intellectual Zabelia Sayan, that was not the dilemma. In fact, the dilemma was not understood as a rights formulation, but rather one of survival in extremis, where the loss of the transferred children was an act of victimizing both children and parents, as well as an element in the conscious destruction of what they considered the Armenian nation by the Ottoman Empire. It is difficult to underestimate the importance that history of transformation through loss of identity, and recovery of Armenian children has had on the formation of modern Armenian identity, especially in the diaspora. The Armenian community itself is now, to a significant extent, a community of descendants of children who faced their own forced transfer or loss of their immediate family, known collectively in Armenian as the vorper, the orphans. How is it that that story is understood and explained within families in the community? What did it mean for the rebuilding of social structures and social networks? In particular, what did it mean to be an Armenian woman or child after the genocide are profound, far-reaching, and multi-generational questions that arise from this aspect of genocide. And equally, how does this shape modern conceptions of Turkish identity as more and more contemporary Turks who call themselves the Torunlar, the grandchildren, confront the reality that their grandmothers have been transferred Armenian girls taken during the genocide that laid the foundations of their modern state, a state which emphasizes the homogeneity of Turkish identity and denies that the Armenian genocide even took place. So I'm not going to go into other aspects of transfer. I wanted to leave enough time for questions, but I wanted to conclude with just a few thoughts on genocide prevention and children and what our task for a meeting like this might be going forward. I'm at war with these microphones. Okay. So this is a workshop or seminar whose unstated focus, in fact, are young people. As I was looking through the program, so much of what this is focusing on is education, outreach, building a new generation of peacemakers. And states, societies, families, political movements all fight for the chance to tell their stories about genocide, violence, the past, the future, the way they want to children. It's a continual struggle. Because they recognizing children and young people as agents, both possible agents of cultural preservation and social change, is a key element of modern society. Now, the transfer of children during genocide is the most heinous of these efforts at telling the story. I mean, at its root is an act of attempted erasure, in fact, of a young person's connection to their youth, their family, their communities, and their ethnic and religious affiliation. Imagine it's just like, you've erased a computer disk and now you've written right over the top of it. But of course, it never really is completely erased. So that erasure can sometimes work, but more often than not, makes young people and children live double lives, one of which is trying to live in the truth, and another is living in a lie. And these become a constant and burdensome battle in the lives of young people. One need look no further than the possibility of the transfer of children and broader trafficking in human persons as a reason why there is an urgency to prevent genocide. One of genocide's chief outcomes is increasing the vulnerability of children and young people to everything from trafficking to this form of transfer. But children, their inherent curiosity, open-mindedness, sense of fairness, and resilience is key to building, through education at all levels, young people capable of taking leadership in the fields of genocide and human rights studies and transitional justice. I call this operationalizing the desire to do good. We ignore, though, that generation, the generation that's coming up at our peril. At no time in history has that generation been more vulnerable to extremist thought of all stripes, religious and political. And I'd like to just hold the internet accountable for that, but there's a whole bunch of other reasons as well. So our collective responsibility, and if I were to give you a charge for this next day, is to think about ways to build that new generation into a force for whom impunity, sexual and gender-based violence, and rights violations are unacceptable. To build a new generation that is empowered to make a better future and a more peaceful world. Thank you.